Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you? So, we got 1 week left of material today. So now it's time to stop doing that. I found this is so cute, right? The map of procrastination, river of excuses, Mount Gaming, TV peak, sudden urge of laundry value, Napland, social media forest, online shopping cove, city of closet reorganization. But wow, look at that, we're all having the same problem, huh? So I figured I gotta print that. So that was pretty cute. Okay, let's talk about some food, from food to poop. Digestive system. We're looking about digestion, which means food breakdown. We'll look at that. We have chemicals that get squirted on the food. That's like your saliva goes on food and starts digesting. And then we also chew. That's mechanical breakdown of food. And then we talk about the pathway of the food tube through the body. And we'll talk about absorption of food particles. And that absorption of food particles when we get the food from the gut tube into the bloodstream. And then we'll have a little bit more, have immune system talking. There's a lot of immune system in the gut. And we finish up with some organization and then some ancillary organs like the liver and such, pancreas and so forth. The gastrointestinal tract or system includes the tract, the digestive tract, and digestive glands. Glands and secrete chemicals that help break down the food chemically. Food is taken into the oral cavity and it is ground up mechanically by chewing. So that serves a purpose. There's all your terminology for the oral cavity. We'll do a little bit of teeth and all that, and sometimes it's too much chewing. Bad boy, look at how it looks. Isn't that cute? They always know they did it badly. The salivary glands in the mouth secrete about a quart to a quart and a half of saliva daily, and that lubricates the food and it makes it into a semi-liquid bolus that we can swallow. So it makes it moist. But it also contains enzymes, and the big one that it contains, the big one for us is amylase. And amylase is carbohydrate digestion. So when you look back at the word ASE, we know it's an enzyme. And we know that breaks down stuff, changes bonds, makes and breaks bonds. So an enzyme helps chemical reactions. And it is a chemical, so in here it helps break down carbohydrates chemically. It's not chewing, you squirt the chemical on it and it starts dissolving because of the interaction of the chemicals. And that's the thing, you eat a savory sandwich and you chew it long enough in the mouth, it's going to get sweet at some point. And that's when the sugar breaks off from the bread and you taste the sweet.
Yeah, the question, like, where are the glands that bring the saliva out? Like, because I feel like
Salivary glands.
But where does it actually, like, come from?
Parotid gland here, submandibular gland here, sublingual gland here.
Well, here.
And then you eat something and all of a sudden something shoots out of your mouth, then you know where they come from. It's like fire hose in the back shooting out. Oh, sorry. And you can stimulate saliva by just focusing on biting into a lemon, and it calms down for most people. Oh, look at all that. That's more, not to really lecture on this slide. This is more helping us understand. I just liked it, that's why I put it in. But look at the functions of saliva. what it helps with the teeth, helps with microorganisms, helps with food. It helps digest amylases, all the other ones in here, but amylase is the big one for us. It helps with the taste. Amylase helps with taste. It helps with water and mucus, making that bolus thing, etc. Antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral properties. And then it helps remineralization of the teeth. It helps protect against demineralization. And it's also a good acid buffer because we don't want too much acidity in the mouth. So there's some good stuff that saliva does. So we'll keep it flowing. So this is just a review page. You don't have to memorize that. And then that brings us to the tongue, because we're gonna, and to the teeth, because we're in the mouth. We're gonna figure out how to move that food around, and the tongue is a really good one to do that. So the tongue is a muscular organ that helps the chewing and the transport of ingested food. It also helps in speech. We talked about that. It makes a speech. And it's also a touch, a sensory organ that codes for touch and for taste. And remember we talked about taste? The main one is chop? No, that's wrong. The way salty, sweet, bitter. Wait. Sweet, salty, bitter, umami, and sour. There you go. Those are the 5 we got. This is just sort of like for fun. We have in the tongue, we have extrinsic muscles and we have intrinsic muscles. Extrinsic mean around the tongue. Intrinsic means inside. So they originate from a bone and they extend to the tongue. They help move the tongue within the oral cavity. So they go from bone to tongue. So they move the tongue around, not the mouth, the tongue. And then the intrinsic muscles do not have a bony attachment, and they help shape the tongue, aiding in speech, swallowing, and in eating. That's the difference between them. We're not going to study all of that, but look, there are all those names. Genio, blah, 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 blah. A lot of like, these are all attachments. The hyoid bone, the glossus is a tongue, and the styloid process is in the skull up here. Remember that little pokey coming down. The teeth help us mechanically digest the food. They, grind the food and tear the food and do all kinds of stuff. Look, these are good for cutting it, incisors here in the front. These are canines are good for tearing. Look at vampires. And the molars are good for grinding. So we have 3 main sort of types of teeth. Molars, we have premolars and molars. And so what they do is they do a dental formula that shows an arrangement of the teeth, both the upper, which are attached into the maxilla, and the lower ones, which are attached into the mandible. So the upper jaw, they both have 16 teeth, 32 total. We have incisors, we have canine, we have premolar, and we have molars, upper and lower. So that's the so-called dental formula. The babies have the deciduous teeth, or called the primary teeth, the baby teeth. They also call them deciduous teeth. They're temporary also. They lack the molars. Or the molars are premolars, basically. Their molars are premolars. And then we go for, which makes sense. The mouth of us is bigger, so it has more teeth. Structurally, a tooth can be divided into a crown on top, but then a neck, and then a root that sits into the bone. The crown extends above the gum line, and it's covered with enamel, and that's the white stuff. That's the hardest material we have in the body. The root down here is covered with cementum, which is cementum, that's right here. That's a gluey thing, and that anchors the tooth via periodontal ligaments onto the bone itself. So here's the periodontal membrane, those ligaments, it's the same thing, and that anchors it right into the bone right in here. The root canal at the apex, down in here, is for nerves and vessels to come in and reach what they call the pulp cavity, which is right down the inside here, the inside of the tooth, the inside, that's the pulp cavity. And in the pulp cavity we have so-called odontoblasts. You see odonto, you're thinking tooth, right? Blasts. When you're thinking of blasts, you're thinking of an immature cell that makes tissue, that makes tooth. So it secretes dentin. And that's the bulk of the tooth is dentin. So there's a few little words. So you hear bulk cavity, dentin, enamel. So that's a pretty okay little graphic to just sort of get a general understanding. Good. That's the teeth, that's the tongue, that's the mouth. Now we're going to go below or behind. First, we're going to get into the pharynx. We already talked about the pharynx in the respiratory system because we have a pharynx up here in the nose, the nasopharynx. Behind the mouth, we have the pharynx part called the oropharynx. And below that, we have one that calls the little ringopharynx that then gets us right into the larynx. We talked about that, the Adam's apple area where we make speech. That separates stuff going into the lungs or into the food tubes down to the stomach. The pharynx is therefore a space that's occupied by air, by liquid, and by food. The trachea is only going to be air unless we choke, which we don't want to. And behind there is then going to be the esophagus, and that's going to be the food pipe.
So how big is the pharynx?
The pharynx is from the nose here, behind the nose, downward, behind the mouth, downward, up to the Adam's apple. Because you're sharing everything down up to there. And then you differentiate food, mass from air, basically. Food, liquid from air. And that's why the trachea is the one that has the cartilages around it, the rings, because it's the air. It needs to stay open. It needs to stay patent. It cannot, otherwise it collapses, and then you can't push it open. That's too much force. And those are open in the back. So in the back, when we eat food, the food tube can expand and push into the trachea without any problem as we swallow. Some smart stuff. Look at that. Swallowing, deglutition, the act of swallowing. A process ensures that the food and liquids reaches the gullet. The gullet is the esophagus, another name for esophagus. Gullet, or we can also call it food pipe. I don't know if they call it food pipe. I call it food pipe. Esophagus. We'll call it esophagus. That's the real name. Although in my anatomy booklet that all these slides are originally not taken from, but made from the text, they call it the gullet. And I like that. It consists of, so the swallowing, as we get the food from the mouth down to the pharynx, and then down into the esophagus, that's a voluntary phase part of it, like I want to swallow now. And then all of a sudden, when that food is somewhere back there, it's an involuntary part, and it's like a reflex. It just goes down. So we start swallowing by pressing the bolus against the soft palate on top, the roof of the mouth, which then triggers the swallowing reflex and seals off the nasal cavity, which is kind of good. It's all right, the food doesn't come out of the nose. You know they did. Have you ever heard of that? In France, in Paris, there's this castle called Versailles. Have you heard of that? They're like the biggest, most pompous, whatever, Middle Ages kind of thing. That's the Sun King, Louis XIV, so Louis XIV, I think it was. And back then, that was like late 1700s, early 1800s. They used them as guinea pig. And this guy had breathing problems, so what they did is they took his soft palate off, thinking to make more room for his breathing. And so when he would eat, food would come out his nose. You don't want to be king back then? Can you imagine? Oh. No, that was gross, right? I read the medical report on that. I was like, oh. Anyway, we don't want to do that. We seal off the nasal cavity by pushing that thing against that palate. Because then when that happens is, the soft palate sort of pushes up and it closes off so nothing can go up here. And then the muscles of the floor of the mouth raise the hyoid bone and the larynx, while the epiglottis is lower, covering the entrance of the trachea. So then you swallow, this is the hyoid bone right here. It goes up a little bit. It goes up slightly and comes back down. And that process, when it comes up, do I have a flower? Is there a esophagus on that? Yeah, it is. When you look at that lung model here, you see that's the entrance going down in here. And that in front here is the Adam's, oops, everything's falling off. In front here, that's the Adam's apple. And that little flap, oops, sorry, you see there's this thing sticking up right there. That's a flap sticking up. And when we swallow, this whole thing goes up, but the flap stays, and it sort of pushes down and covers the hole going down. So that epiglottis is a flappy thing. It's elastic cartilage, so it's very flexible. And so as we bring the trachea up, that epiglottis, which is this part right here, flips down, and the food cannot go into the windpipe, and it covers it up. It kind of makes like a roof over it, and then the food glides off into the esophagus. The problem is when we speak or laugh and swallow at the same time and do things, then we choke, because we're going to have some food that goes down into the windpipe, and we don't want that. If it goes into the trachea, it occludes and it prevents ventilation to the lungs. So if a food is stuck in the trachea, the other problem with that is you can't talk. You can't get air out. If you can't get air out, you can't talk. So you're going to have to make this like simple thing that like you're choking, and then you do the Heimlich maneuver. Have you heard of the Heimlich maneuver? Yeah? So the Heimlich maneuver, what you do is you take a fist and put it right there by the xiphoid, underneath the xiphoid, and then you take the other hand and lay it. Well, actually, what I was taught, you take a fist on the xiphoid and then take another fist, go underneath it, because if you break this off, this is not good. You don't want to break this off. This is very, very sharp, and it's attached to the diaphragm, and if that breaks off, it can pull back and pierce the liver, and that's not a good thing. And so we don't want that. So we want to make sure we're below the xiphoid and go underneath it, and inside of the stomach we then push in and up at the same time, and increase intra-abdominal pressure to hopefully launch out the thing that's stuck in there. I had to do that once with my kid, that one. And the pizza came right out. I don't know. It's a little bit scary, but it's interesting how fast it went. It's just like it was totally natural. It was like nothing was like, ah! It was like, just, oh, you did something stupid, okay, here, boom, boom. And it went back out. And, well, maybe I just remember it like heroic like that, maybe, I don't know. But that's choking, and that's the Heimlich maneuver. And so now you can help people if that happens. Good, so that brings us to past the pharynx, past the larynx, now into the esophagus, the gullet. It transports the bolus, the food now is called the bolus, to the stomach. It has to penetrate the diaphragm, and you know, the diaphragm is this round muscle. You see it right in here, right here. You see this. This is the diaphragm. And it's got to go through the diaphragm right here. And that thing here is called the esophageal hiatus. The hole where it goes through, it pierces through. The diaphragm is round. We want to have specific area where these go through, because the diaphragm separates the thoracic from the abdominal pelvic cavity. And we want to be very sealed off from one another, because this up here is more airy, and this down here is very liquidy and fatty and all kind of weird shit. But, oops, better language, sorry. But we want to have where these go through, where the vessels go through and the esophagus goes through, we have these hiatuses. And the esophageal hiatus goes through here, and then it connects right to the stomach. And the stomach is this, you know, baggy organ that we're going to talk next about. Heartburn is a burning sensation that we get in the chest, and is associated when some food comes back and pierces up from the stomach and burns the esophagus. Because the stomach is very, very acidic. And gastric acid is like HCl is a pH of like 2. It's very, very acidic. And if that doesn't seal off here where the esophagus goes into the stomach and it pierces through the diaphragm, then that creates a lot of burning. And we associate that with burning in here, and they call that heartburn, because it's by the heart where it hurts. It's nothing really to do with the heart. Good. So that brings us to a place where we can talk about the walls of the gullet, because of the esophagus, because they're pretty much the same, more or less the same structure of the entire GI tract. So if you talk small intestine, if you talk stomach, if you talk esophagus, large intestine, we all have those layers. Some are more developed than others, but we all have those layers in those areas. So we have an innermost layer, that's called the mucosa, and that's like very, very deep. That's epithelium, that's back epithelial tissue. That's where we basically gonna absorb the food molecules. And then we got a submucosal layer, and the submucosa is, well, above the mucosa. And then we have from there we have a skeletal muscle coat. Wait. Why do I say skeletal muscle coat? I don't think that's right. We'll just say muscle coat. Gotta go through that again. Because I don't want to think of when my stomach is contracting. So when I think skeletal muscle, I'm thinking voluntary. This, I'm sure, says smooth muscle coat. And somebody better text me that mistake in my book. And that muscle coat consists of an internal layer, and the internal layer is circular. So you got one layer here that goes around, and then you got one layer that's lengthwise. So circular means around, and the longitudinal means lengthwise. That's kind of cool, because now what you can do is you can constrict this one and squeeze the tube and pinch the food off from front to back. And then you can contract the longitudinal one. It's kind of like a worm going and moving. Like you contract a little and a segment moves forward. And so you can do that with the food. You can move the food forward that way. It's pretty neat. And then on top of the muscle layer, we have a serosa. And the serosa is always the outermost layer of an organ, anchors the organ into its surroundings and adheses it and glues it together. And well, some better, some not as good. I've been listening to really interesting YouTubes on fascia. And they're now doing fundamental studies like how hard or soft these fascia connections are, these parts between organs that hold things together, and how mobile things are. That has down to a difference of like how cancer spreads. I mean, some real deep weird stuff. We go like, woo, excuse me, really? And so that's fundamental research. We'll see that they started researching that about really from a scientific committee in 2007. So there's just new stuff that's coming up. So it's very interesting. But there are also outermost layers. You always think of anchoring in the surroundings, making sure things are in the right place, and they're attached to another properly, and so forth. Usually less of a functional part from an organ-specific function. And here's that peristalsis, where we have alternation of the contraction of the two layers, the internal circle and the outside longitudinal layer, that facilitates movement of ingested material. Because you can pinch off, you can pinch off and you can squeeze that together, and then you can keep pinching and moving the food forward out. Something like that. Think of a worm on the street. And that gets us to the stomach. And the stomach lies up in the upper left quadrant. That's if you take the belly button, you have right 1, 2, 3, 4 quadrants. And up here is the stomach. Up here over here is the liver. So that's kind of those two big organs. And then we've got a whole bunch of stuff around it too. It's just below the diaphragm. That's just where that esophagus pierces through and then goes into the stomach here. It secretes gastric juice, which is very, very acidic. That's a pH of 1.2 to 2. It secretes 2 to 3 quarts. A liter, you think of a quarter. A liter, quarter, about the same. And it's acidic because there's a lot of hydrochloric acid in it. There's water, hydrochloric acid, mucus. You need a lot of mucus with all that acid. And then it has protein splitting enzyme pepsin in it. So the stomach has a lot to do with protein digestion, starting protein digestion. In the mouth, we start, for the most part, we start the sugar digestion. That's why we want to eat the food properly and chew it properly, partly because of the mechanical, but partly also because we start having enzymes on. And then in the stomach, we really start the protein digestion. And the HCl, that acidity, also takes the bolus and really makes it a liquid and liquefies it into a paste. So it's more and more breakdown that we have smaller and smaller molecules that then the system can absorb. And we call that paste chyme. And chyme is made mechanically by muscular layers actions before it's transported into the small intestine. The stomach has a third diagonal muscle layer. So it has 3 layers that can just move that stuff around. So that's kind of cool. And it takes it from 1 to 5 hours. The fattier, the longer. The fattier the food, the longer it takes to clear the stomach. That's why you can eat fatty foods and then go, you know, I had this Raider strength coach in the house like 3 years ago or something, like a while back of a coach. And he told me they would give the players ribs for lunch when they practice. Stuff like that, like fatty stuff. That will stay in the stomach and make you feel heavy like nothing else. You're gonna go to sleep. So that's kind of interesting with that. The heavier the meal, the longer it stays in the stomach. The stomach is a baggy organ, muscular. It has a few structures to it that we want to point out. It's got the cardia is the entrance, the inlet where it comes in. Then above, so then you have a cardia is right here, or the inlet where it comes in is right here. And then you've got a bubble that goes above the inlet, and we call that the fundus. Because sometimes we find, well, air bubbles in the fundus when we take an x-ray, so we can situate that. Sometimes we have butterflies in the stomach, but that's a little different. And what else do we need to know? So we have a fundus, then we have a body. The body is also the big old thing. And then at the end, very close to the outside, to the small intestine, and duodenum here, that's small intestine. We're going to see that. Okay, that's the small intestine has multiple layers to it, and the duodenum is the first part, multiple parts. And this end area here, we call that anything pyloric canal, and then we have a pyloric sphincter. When you think of a sphincter, you're thinking of a round muscle. Here, the sphincter, that's muscle tissue here. And that can squeeze this. And that is very important because as we want the food to just come in and then get digested, we got to measure how much goes to the next section. Because this is very acidic, this is not acidic. We got to make sure we balance things out so we don't mess up what's going down in here. And we also need to make sure, is it digested enough? We need to be able to control. We need to be able to keep it in that stomach for 5 hours if it needs to be doing that. And so that's the pylorus, is the pyloric sphincter. We have a curve on the outside, that's the greater curvature. How innovative is that, right? And then one on the inside, that's the lesser curvature. And you're going to have these plates, they're actually over there. We should have put them on the tables, but here that's the stomach, that's the esophagus. We have the pharynx right in here, and then that's going to be the liver. But first, what we're going to do now is we're going to go past the stomach into the first section of the small intestine, and the small intestine is this stuff, the brownish stuff, and the large intestine goes around it. That's the darker gray stuff.
That's the what?
The large intestine. Oh, it's just the darker one. Yeah. The large intestine. When we look deep into microscopically into the stomach, it has these rugae, it has these folds right here that you can sort of, it's like felty when you actually feel it. It's kind of weird, but it feels felty. And the rugae have tiny holes in them, and they open into gastric pits. And so this is a gastric pit. And so that's just, you know, a pit going along down, a shaft. And along that pit, we have multiple different cells, and these different cells secrete different things. And so we got on the bottom we got chief cells, and the chief cells secrete pepsinogen. That's pepsin, that's not quite pepsin yet. Pepsin digests protein, and you know, a lot of us is protein, so it's very delicate because we don't want pepsin around digesting our own protein when the protein needs to be functioning. We need to wait till we have food that wants to digest that protein. And so the pepsinogen is inactive, it's non-functioning. So it doesn't do nothing, but it's right one step before it's functioning. And so what happens is it's secreted here. And the next cells are the parietal cells, they secrete HCl. And then the next cells are the mucus cells, and they secrete protective mucus. So the pepsinogen comes up here, and if there's food present, the HCl also comes in here, and the HCl activates the pepsinogen and makes pepsin out of it. So you need that acid to activate the pepsinogen and make pepsin out of it. Here, that's the parietal cell, that's the HCl, and that makes pepsin out of it. HCl, of course, is great because it's so acidic. It's also bactericidal. So you can eat a whole bunch of crap, and it's all bacteria. It's all like serious acidity in there. So a lot of stuff dies in the stomach. That's why we get away with a lot of food that we eat. And it has to be that way. Oh, sheesh. I have that slide? Okay. So those are all the cells that secrete the gastric juice. When we secrete it, what causes the secretion to happen? We have different things that can cause this stomach secretion to happen. Three of them. One is called the cephalic phase. And the cephalic phase is you thinking about food, your stomach starting doing some stuff. You start secreting. So you can close your eyes. You know, that's actually, if you think neurologically, part of the prayer before food is for that. You sort of start focusing on what you're going to eat. And it sets the system ready, and it starts secreting gastric juice, which is very important to understand that we should not eat the sandwich in the car when we do other things, because that we're not going to really do that. So the food just ends up getting there, and then what happens after that? So when the food itself comes down, that also triggers, food itself triggers the secretion of the hormone, gastrin, which then reaches HCl secreting cell through the bloodstream that activates them to secrete more HCl. So when food arrives into the stomach, that secretes a hormone that goes through the bloodstream, all around the body, and then a hormone attaches to the parietal cells, and HCl production goes up. It gets a little complicated. Any question?
Yeah, so if you're starving, you don't make any secretion. Like, if you...
Yeah, I don't know that. I don't know when the cycle stops. I mean, you're getting hungry and you feel the stomach hunger. That's secretion happening. That's...
And their stomach starts to blow, even though they have no food in their stomach.
Well, yeah, but that's a water imbalance. That's a kidney. That's when the kidneys start failing. Because the body digests everything, including the fat layer that's around the kidney capsule. And when that is also digested, because it's energy, then the kidneys are no longer protected, and then the water imbalance gets all goofy. Kwashiorkor, I think it's called. All right. Anyway, so we have different levels of when that gastric juice gets activated or inhibited at times. And then the last one, the third one, is when we get the food going from the stomach into the first part of the intestine, the small intestine, and that's called the duodenum. Then the stomach, the chyme coming from the stomach is either promoted or inhibited depending on how much is present and how much acidity is present and how much more does need to be digested. So that's called the intestinal phase. So it's a feedback loop basically, where the stomach, the intestine feeds back to the stomach and says like, yeah, a little bit more of that, it's fine tuning. So it's very interesting. I just put those up. I know it's complicated looking, but if you have time and you go in and you're like, there's stress receptors, there's chemoreceptors, a whole bunch of stuff going on. or you'll learn more later on. Those are some interesting pictures. Good, that brings us to the small intestine. So it's about 3 to 5 meters long. A meter is about about a yard. Going from the stomach, starting at the stomach, right here, ending with the last part of the ileum, that then goes into the large intestine. The first part is known as the duodenum. And duodenum is also known as 12-finger gut. So it's like 12 fingers laid next to one another. And it embraces, you can't see that here because it's not there, but it embraces the head of the pancreas that comes in here. And the pancreas is the organ, it's right here, the pancreas comes in here. The pancreas is the organ that makes pancreatic enzymes which digest a lot of the food. So a lot of the food breakdown molecules, the enzymes, come from the pancreas. And we'll have a slide on the pancreas. We also learned about the pancreas when we came to sugar handling. Insulin and glucagon. That's also the pancreas. That's the hormonal quality of the pancreas. Much of the chemical digestion from macro to micromolecules happens in the duodenum. So the food we chew in the mouth, we get to the stomach, we have some amylase in there, some pepsin in there, but now we get really to getting the breaking down on the chemicals. The food is now ready to have these chemicals be squirted on it and break them down. And then from there, from the duodenum, we go to the jejunum. So there's 3 small intestine parts. There's the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And the jejunum is where we have a lot of surface area. We have a lot of folds, we have villi, we even have microvilli, which are just smaller and smaller finger things. Although the microvilli is where we have a lot of the enzymes on it that then talk to the food and digest the food. The villi are like fingers that project up that can absorb food. They have that's a villi, has blood vessels going up and down. And so the food in the jejunum, a lot of the absorption of nutrient happens in that area. So in the duodenum, the food gets further broken down, and in the jejunum, we have absorption of the nutrients. A lot of the absorption of the nutrients. And then as we get further away from the duodenum, the surface extension decreases gradually, and less food is absorbed, but more and more water will be absorbed. And then the ileum is the final portion, and it closes or comes to an end at the ileocecal valve, which is right here. And then that stuff, so that is like right here. That's right down here, where the small intestine goes into the large intestine. The large intestine feeds around, and then we poop it out. And so, ileocecal valve, you see they have the appendix right here, that little worm-like structure. That they used to think, oh, whenever we open the stomach, we'll just take it out, it doesn't do nothing. And then you realize there's too many guys in white coats talking. Because it's like, there's nothing in the body that just doesn't do nothing. And so now they know people with no appendix have more Alzheimer's and stuff like that, apparently. Yeah, Sonia just showed me a study that was on that. So that's kind of interesting. When we look at the absorption, we have, the submucosa creates these folds, and then from the folds, we have villi sticking up, finger-like projections. They're like 1 millimeter. That's like this high. They're a tiny thing. But they contain a capillary and a lymphatic vessel. And then the food gets absorbed into those. So the enterocytes, which are epithelial cells, they're like the lining on the mucosa, they line each villi, these plain microvilli, which are little small brush border things. They're like hair sticking out, and they go into the lumen, and they have a lot of the enzymes are sitting around there that break down the food further and further and further. So micronutrients then get created there, and they pass through those cells, and then from there they get into the bloodstream or into the lymph. If they're hydrophobic, they go into the lymph. The fat goes to the lymph. Hydrophilic goes to the bloodstream. Water loving goes to the bloodstream. That's the carbs, the protein, and all that sort of stuff. So that's sort of the short end of a very long story that you can go and do physio, because you can do all the enzymes and it's just lists of what does it break down. It's very interesting. It's hard to remember it all. And then water-soluble nutrients from the gut get directly transported to the liver via what we call the hepatic portal vein. So you got a connection from the stomach straight to the liver, hepatic portal vein. And there, the nutrients, well, everything gets processed. The liver processes everything. If you have fatty stuff that goes in the bloodstream, that goes to the lymph, and the lymph goes and dumps everything into the bloodstream near the heart. And then it gets processed as the blood goes to the liver from its regular general circulation. I know, interesting, right? Now the next topic is immune system. So you're thinking about the GI tract is an extremely easy place we can get stuff in that is not good for us. So we have a lot of foreign antigens, a lot of pathogens can come through it. About 70 or 80% then of all antibody producing cells are in the GI tract. So about a large portion of the immune system is located in the gut, which again is very sensible because a lot of stuff comes there. So these lymphatic follicles that have these antibody producing cells in them, they're organized in groups, and those groups are called Peyer's patches. And they're also, a lot of them are also within the appendix. That's why you don't want to get that appendix out. The problem is the appendix, if it inflames, you got to take it out, because if it bursts, it's real bad. Then that inside here goes into the inside cavity of the stomach, like of the gut, like the inside, not the. This is a tube that's connected to the outside. You got a mouth, you got a butt. It's the outside. It's always connected to the outside. But beyond that tube, what's on this side of the tube, that's the inside of the person. That is an environment that's not able to cope with all the bacteria that's here. And so that's why when an appendix is inflamed, you got to take it out so that it doesn't burst. Because then you have sepsis coming off and you get all the infection coming in. You don't want that. That's very bad. All right, but we have a lot of these Peyer patches, and then we have these cells, the immune cells in the appendix as well. And the grouped lymphatic follicles in those Peyer's patches, they like arch over like domes between the villi that come out and stick out. So the food gets down here, and all the, the antigens, the pathogens are in here. That's the lumen. And when they pick up something, well, let's see. Let me just read this. So this is then one of those Peyer patches, one of those areas right in here that's depicted in here with the cells. So you have different types of cells. See, here you got the antigen. See the antigen right here. So the antigen flows around in the system in the gut. This is the lumen. And so the M cells, which are known as, they're called microfolded cells, they recognize and take up the antigen, and then they pass it on to a macrophage. That's, again, we talked about the antigen presenting cells. They eat the antigen and they present it, and then they activate the T and the B cells. And now you're in this dome on the inside, and you're activating these B and T cells. And the B cells are the plasma kind, and then they migrate through the lymph and the blood, producing immunoglobulins, specifically the type A. Remember, in the immune system, you have this one sheet where you have these 5 groups of immunoglobulins. The type A is what these make. That's, you can look that up, it's just where it is. And then that travels to the liver to reach the intestine again via the bile. Oh. Bile we get to. Bile is the green stuff. Gallbladder, have you heard of gallbladder? Gallbladder is a pouch that holds the bile, and the bile is an emulsifier, like a soap that you wash your dishes with, but in the stomach, so the oil, the fat gets dispersed, so it's not all clumping together. So that's what bile does. But bile obviously has more than that. So it's gonna be able to also have these immunoglobulins in it that recognize the stuff that has been coming by as an antigen before, and now it's right there in the intestine, in the lumen. And so that way then it reaches the intestine and it can attack the antigen as it comes by before it even reaches the body on the inside. So it's really, really smart that way. Mother's milk also passes on passive immunity of encountered antigens to the nurse's infant. I'm not so sure why I wrote that paragraph there, but that's good to know. I think we talked about that. Plasma cells within the Peyer's patches secrete IgAs into the intestine and combine with corresponding antigens. So that's what I meant before, right? So that you're going to have the antibodies in the lumen where we eat the food, and it combined right there with the antigens, bypassing the system completely. We just poop it out. We just get rid of it. And we don't even have to worry about it coming into the body. So that's a pretty neat system how it does that. A pretty neat system. And that brings me to the large bowel. And that's this piece here. Nice baby massage. You got a baby with colic. You want to massage the large bowel around the chest. Here's the chest. You want massage around here. But what we want to do is you want to work a little bit here on the side where it goes out, because the baby needs a fart, right? So you can push the gas out. So you don't want to push all the way from this to all the way over, because you're going to back up. You're going to do a little bit of here. You strike it out so the gas can come out. You go a little further up and you sort of start, then at the end you start going around. The babies love that. Baby massage. I know. I became I didn't become a baby massage instructor, but my first wife did. So she did a workshop for that, and so that's very soothing. So anyway, here's where it starts. We have the appendix right here. Appendicitis is when it's inflamed, when we need to go take it out. Then the large intestine goes up. So we have a portion that's known as the ascending colon, the going up colon. Then we have a transverse colon, the going across colon. And then we have a descending colon, the going down colon. And then from there it makes a wiggle and likes an S shape. Well, they call that the sigmoid colon because of an S. And then as it gets straight again, we call it the rectum, and then it's the anus at the back. And that's where it goes. Bye! Have a good trip. We also have colic flexures. We have one on the right, that's a turning point, one on the right and one on the left. Externally, longitudinal muscle bands now. These are in the intestine, the small intestine, muscles around the whole thing. These are these leftover longitudinal muscle fibers. They call them tinea coli. And they have fatty parts attached to it. They call those epiploic appendages. You don't need to study all of those terms, but they're all there. So you can see the fatty things hanging off, that's what they are. Contraction of the circular muscle layer forms these little things. These are what I want you to know though. These little pouches right here, these are called haustras, like little houses, called haustras. That's a nice picture for you to study from, the way you do it in the anatomy book. The mucosa does not, in the large intestine, the lower innermost layer does not contain villi. So water and salt is absorbed there through microvilli. In there we have a lot of goblet cells which produce mucus. That's the glidy stuff. That's very important. And the other thing we have in that large intestine, we have a lot of good bacteria in there. There's the joke, right, that you're going to have some electricity over here. There's the joke that we have more foreign DNA in us and around us than we have our own DNA. And the referral of that is the fact that we have a lot of good bacteria. You heard of probiotics? Prebiotics, probiotics, postbiotics? No. The biotics they're good bacteria. If we take antibiotics, anti-bios means against life. Bio means life. So antibiotics doesn't just kill the bad crap, which we want to do. the bacteria. It also kills our own bacteria. And so that's why when somebody takes antibiotics, often they get the runs, because the bacteria don't do their work. So bacteria in the gut are known as commensals because they help us decompose indigestible food items and much more stuff. They have found that bacteria in the gut digest, that's probably in rats or somewhere, they digest food, they fart, they release a gas, and the gas goes in the bloodstream, goes to the brain, makes the mouse feel happy. So there's a lot going on that we need to have a happy stomach. We need to try to keep a happy stomach as much as we can. So if you have to take antibiotics, you know, sometimes you want to question it. Like, I mean, not always, but at least you can ask the question to the doctor, because I have had my daughter, my stepdaughter and her daughter, she calls and she has a little cough or something, the guys at the hotline, and they want to give her antibiotics over the phone. I'm like, excuse me, that's not that cool. But, you know, because they also think, you know, the more antibiotics you take throughout life, the worse your gut health is. And then we got Crohn's disease and all that, and I did hear places where, I don't know what, you know, how peer-reviewed that study was, but I do remember reading something where Crohn's disease was come together with overdoing antibiotics. This was like not a result, maybe direct correlation, but there was a connection. So anyway, we're going to keep our gut healthy with good bacteria. That's when you drink kombucha, that's the bacteria stuff. You eat kimchi, fermented foods, that's all what that is for. Good. And then that brings us to, oh look, then we're going to talk about movement. That's the gotta go. It's like movements in the large intestines happen in like peristaltic waves, which are mass movements that happen towards the rectum. And so food just kind of goes towards the rectum, gets piled up, and then we gotta go to the bathroom at some point. And you have two sphincters. You got an internal sphincter, an internal anal sphincter. That's a thickening of the circular muscle layers down here. That is involuntary. So a baby cannot hold it. And then you've got an external sphincter, and that's regular striated muscle, skeletal muscle. When you see striated, you think skeletal muscle, voluntary. You can squeeze that butt together yourself. And the baby has to learn that as we grow up, because that's voluntary. There is also, I listened to a massage therapist talking, and he's really, really high end. Wrote a book, Mike, what's his name? Tom Myers, the anatomy trained. And he said muscles in here, the tight butt, he wonders if these were children that were forced to potty train too soon. And they just contract all the butt muscles because they don't have to control yet to just sort of go for the deep ones and then have that beat. So that's interesting. Food for thought. Don't let your kid be as natural as possible with that. It'll work out. Good. Peritoneum. The abdominal cavity is lined with the serous membranes. We talked about serous membranes quite a bit in the lungs. Remember, we talked two-membrane system. We discussed the heart and the lungs. In the gut, we have that in the peritoneal cavity. Here, we have that same thing. We have organs that are surrounded by a visceral layer and suspended from the posterior wall via these suspensory ligaments. So you can see here where it comes together. So there's these ligaments that come down on the cross section. You can see that the sagittal section, how the gut is really nicely organized and arranged. We think it's a big old mess when we just look at this from the front. But when you take a cross section and you see how it's arranged, you can see how organized it is. And we have these suspensory ligaments that come from the back wall and hang these organs down. We have one of them, they're called mesentery of the small intestine, mesocolon, greater or less omentum. There are different names that I don't need you to study, but that's where they are. And those here, they carry vessels, nerves to the organs and supply the organs that way. And so that keeps it all organized. So in the lungs, the serous membrane helps to suction along to the chest wall. In the heart, it sort of gives the back so the heart can pump and move a little bit freely. Down in here in the gut, it organizes and holds the gut together so it doesn't get all twisted and knotted up. Because that ain't pretty when it gets knotted up. Some organs are not in that system. That system is protection also. The retroperitoneal organs are behind it, and they're a little bit more vulnerable to shaking and stuff. That's why the kidneys need to be protected. When you have a car accident and it shakes up, and you have urine in the blood, they x-ray your kidneys to make sure everything's okay, for example. We talked briefly about the pancreas. That's a very important organ. It's a digestive gland. It secretes about 2 liters of pancreatic juice from here into the duodenum. It's got a head that is close by the duodenum. Then it's got a body, and then it's got a tail. It also secretes insulin and glucagon that helps us to block glucose level. Its pancreatic juice is very rich in bicarbonate ions. Remember, bicarbonate ions, you neutralize acid with that. That's the Alka-Seltzer, stomach acid. If we eat too much acidic stuff, same thing. So it neutralizes the acid chine. And then what it has, the pancreatic juice, has all the enzymes, or the majority of the enzymes that digest fat, protein, and carbohydrates in it. And the liver is the largest exocrine gland in the human body. It lies in the upper abdominal corridor, below the diaphragm. Secretes bile, and bile helps us fat absorption, or helps the fat absorption by emulsifying fat. In terms of bile, bilirubin is part of it. That's the end product of the hemoglobin breakdown. That's when we break down red blood cells. And that gives us a very green color. When you look at a cadaver, you can always spot where the gallbladder is. It's bright green. Well, not bright green, but for a thing like that, it's bright. We also have cholesterol in there. We have minerals in there. We have these immunoglobulins in there that we just talked about. So that's bile. The liver also further, besides making bile, it metabolizes carbohydrates, proteins, fats, helps detoxify us by inactivating medications and poisons. It also synthesizes many blood components, such as albumin, which is part of that osmotic pressure in the blood, that when the blood goes through the tissues and the capillaries, everything squeezes out except for these large proteins. And on the other side of the capillary bed, the liquid comes back into the bloodstream because we have the osmotic pull by these larger molecules. If you forgot osmosis, remember the salt and the tomato. Now, the liver is our filter. Like the car, you go every 3,000-4,000 miles, you want to change a filter. We cannot do that in the liver. So we kind of tax it on and make it stuffy and clog it up when we get older, and it's a little harder to work with it. It needs a little help. And so here I thought I'd put a chart of liver cleansing foods up that we could drink. We could eat some apples. Some turmeric is good for everything, of course, as we probably heard of turmeric, right? If you haven't heard of turmeric, read up turmeric. But all this stuff is good for the liver. So drink some green tea. Give it a break. Well, I should talk to myself about that. Viewing from the front, the liver has a right lobe and a left lobe. It's separated by the falciform ligament. And the falciform ligament becomes the round ligament down in here. No, where is it? Falciform ligament. Oh, now I gotta read up. Have you done the liver? Bio 2? Is the falciform, the teres the same? Do you know? Anyway, it's the round ligament below, and the round ligament, what's important about that is we don't have to tag it. Is it the remnant of the fetal umbilical vein? So that's the round ligament. In the back, when we go back here, facing the intestine, the liver gate is there, which is the hepatis, porta hepatis, which is where the vessels go in and out. So we always have a place where that happens into an organ. And then we got a couple more lobes in the back. We got a tail lobe, a caudate lobe, and a quadrate lobe. Caudate lobe, where's the quadrate lobe? there's the quadrate lobe. With us, there, we just got to do right and left. On the inside, when we look at the liver and we cut it apart, we look what is actually going on, we can see these sponge-like connective tissue has hexagonal lobules right here that stick up and down. They're very small, but they are sort of the functional unit of the liver. So here's one that's cut open. So they have a central vein in here that drains the lobule down, and then it has a hepatic portal vein that comes in and brings the food stuff, or the blood stuff with the food in it, towards the central vein, and along the way we can process what's going through. And then opposite, a biliary duct making the bile leaves it and exits on the outside of the lobule into the bile ducts. Between the hepatocytes, we have tiny little sinusoids which penetrate towards the central vein, eventually feeding the hepatic vein. That's okay. Phagocytic Kupffer cells, those are important, line the sinusoid, providing immune function. When you think of Kupffer cells, you think of macrophage. When you think of macrophage, you think of monocyte as a white blood cell. That's a white blood cell. It's one of those on the blood cell thing, the big ones. So in the lungs, we call them dust cells, same thing. Monocytes, macrophages that are resident. In the skin, we call them Langerhans cells. Here we call them Kupffer cells. Good. And that has one slide on the gallbladder. We already talked about it a little bit. It's the green bag. It's a pear-shaped sac that comes down from the quadrate lobe, blah, blah, blah. It stores and concentrates the bile. And the bile, what you want to know about the bile is primarily the emulsification property it has. So if you're thinking of fat, it globs together. If you're thinking of a salad dressing, you got the watery part and the oily part on top of it. You need to shake it. If you don't want to have to shake it, you're going to take a molecule that is on one side hydrophobic and on the other side hydrophilic. So it's polar and non-polar. Fat is non-polar. So on one side, this now can bind to the fat. On the other side, it can bind to the water. It can go around the fat molecules and isolate, make little small droplets instead of it being a big old fat blob. This is like your detergent when you wash dishes. Bile is your dish detergent, is an emulsifier. Emulsification, here's the word, emulsification. So that's what bile does. If you get the gallbladder out, you're going to have a little harder time with fat digestion. You still works because you just don't have the storage. You still make bile, but you don't. It just drips into the intestine. It doesn't get stored, and then the body can use it when it eats a lot of it all of a sudden. So you have to probably be a little bit more careful with the fatty foods, or too much fatty foods all at once. Good, and what is that? That gives us the last piece here. That's the overview of the, fat digestion. I don't need to go too heavy in it. Overview of carbohydrate digestion, and then protein digestion. When you think of fat digestion, you're thinking of these chemicals. Look, there's a lipase. So most fats are triglycerides. Lipases are the fat digestions. We have some lingual, that's tongue. So we have some in the mouth already. So you put these names together when you think of that. And we have the carbs, we have the amylase, we have more amylase, we have disaccharidase. So that takes a disaccharide sugar into a monosaccharide sugar. So a lot of the enzyme names are very explainable. Or, you just have to slow it down. And a protein is the pepsin that starts in the breaking down the proteins in the stomach. And then we have the trypsin, chymotrypsin, carboxypeptidase, and so forth that then all these interesting names that then they digest the rest of the peptide chains, the protein peptide chains, into single amino acids. And then the single amino acids will be absorbed. I kind of like that chart just as an overview for, we start in the mouth, stomach, small intestine, and we get the carbohydrate digestion, salivary amylase, pancreatic, and so we can sort of like just list it up. These things they kind of help me in Bio 4 type material. And it's like a lot of physiology stuff, and just lists and lists of these things. And that's it. Good. So thank you for your attention with that. That's a long lecture. Any questions right now?